So, wait a second, I gotta find the timer.
Yes, you do.
I have to find the timer. I love doing Torah. But I have to time myself. I promised Laura that she'd actually have a chance to talk today. So I do. No, I'm serious. That's why it's going. It's right now. I'm using up my time. I can't believe it. Okay, so we do Torah a little bit different here at Congregation Beth Adam, and we read Torah not for the sake of simply reading Torah. We read Torah as an attempt to get some understanding about how the legends and the ancestors of our people came into place, to give you some understanding of how scholars and historians understand the text as it is here. Sometimes we read it and we forget. These are legends. These are tales. These were stories created by our ancestors with specific purposes in mind. We're not going to have time to read all of, in depth, the whole section we've chosen. Just a little bit. I hope to highlight some key understandings about some scholarship, as well as to bring you to the place that we're talking about. At Beth Adam, we don't always read what is called the assigned Torah portion. Rabbis long ago picked portions, and oftentimes people who come hear the same portion over and over and over and over again. So we think it's a great opportunity to explore the Torah. So we've chosen something later. Laura mentioned it last night. Rabbi Barr mentioned when she read her midrash that are our creations, that we're reading from the book of Numbers. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, right? We have Sunday school this Sunday, so we can talk about that more. And where are we at? We're standing at the moment when the Israelites are about to enter the land of Canaan. Now, I just want to bring you up to speed. I want to sort of help you remember. Adam and Eve, right? We're not going to remember. They were slaves for a while. They were slaves in Egypt. Everyone remembers that Passover story. The Israelites escape. They go to Sinai. They get the 10 Commandments. They go from Sinai to enter the promised land, the land of Canaan. This is before the 40 years of wandering. That was a fairly quick journey. This is the first time they're standing there. And there are Moses, in order to understand what's going on, Moses sends in scouts or spies. Now, we just had a long conversation. One of the things that everyone needs to understand about translations, there is no such thing as an exact translation. Translations, by definition, and have sort of values in them. A spy is somehow different than a scout, depending, right? Now, remember, they were entering the Promised Land. Now, the Promised Land wasn't an empty land. There were people there, the Canaanites. They were in the land. So the spies or the scouts, depending on which side of that translation divide you want to be on, went in to look around. They needed to decide seriously if they thought they could wage the war. So this midrash last night that Laura read was about, did they see the people there as big or small? So they were trying to decide. 12 scouts. Now what's interesting in the portion we're about to read, there are actually stories that are woven together. If you've been at Beth Adam and you've been at adult education or listened to Torah portions before, you know that the Torah is not a sort of monolithic story. It's many stories that are woven together, and even in the same tale, there are different streams of thought. We know in the tale we're reading there are at least 2, maybe even 3 different streams of thought woven together, and we know that by where the scouts went. Some of the scouts only stayed in the south, some went to the north. So there are different tales here. So they went in to evaluate, could they be victorious? Now what's interesting is there was no value judgment or morality made about the idea of waging war against people who already live in the land. It's just a fact. They're going to go in and they have to decide. Morality about war isn't really talked about in the Torah. Rabbis talk about it later. Now, I have to say this. Given all that's happening in the Middle East and the Palestinians asking for a vote for a separate state and the UN debate, I don't want any of you to think that this is what this is about. Okay? This is really important. We had a long conversation, and I've talked to friends of ours, colleagues of ours. Were you going to give a sermon, or are you going to give a sermon about Israel? And what we've decided is there is too much to discuss about the issue of the Palestinian request for a state and the UN vote. We're not talking about this. Please don't imagine or infer from what I'm about to read or the comments I'm making that these are some secret messages that I have about the politics of the Middle East. If you're interested in that conversation, come Sunday morning to Adult Education. We're going to spend time looking at the different issues and the different reasons why this is going on. We're reading this simply as a story, that legend when the Jews are standing there, the Israelites are standing at the edge of Canaan, getting ready to enter the land. And that's where we're at right now. Okay, so I got to find my place again. Oh, here it is. No, it's not. Bifocals are really make it always more difficult to... Lamakomahu Karad Nahal Eshkol. And the place was called the Wadi Eshkol. Okay, everyone know a wadi is a dried riverbed. Now, last night I made a reference to remembering my senior sermon. I guess it's having been 30 years out of HUC, I'm remembering things. I had to remember when I was in Israel 30 wadis. The map of Israel, of all these dried riverbeds. And I was a pretty diligent student. And I assume I passed that test. But the only wadi I remember is the Wadi Eshkol. A friend of mine didn't know any of the wadis. And he wrote down 30 songs that began with the phrase, what do you do? So, what do you do when you're down and out, baby? What do you do when nobody loves you? Now, I can remember 2 more songs that I can remember of wadis. So, I don't know who did a better job learning their stuff. So they called it the Wadi Eshkol. I just lost my place again. I got the pointer. Al Edot HaEshkol Asher Kartu Misham B'nei Yisrael. Because of the cluster that they cut down there. Eshkol is a cluster. What that's referring to is the verse before. The spies or the scouts cut down a cluster of grapes that was so large, so enormous, that it took 2 spies or 2 scouts to carry them back on a frame. Now, if you've ever looked at a Israel tourism website, or you've seen some of the flyers, you'll see oftentimes the image of 2 people carrying grapes. That's where this comes from. It's the symbol of Israel, that it is that these grapes were large and strong, so the Israelite government uses that. The Israel government uses that as a image. So we continue. And the spies, they returned after 40 days. 40 days. Ever hear of 40 days mentioned in the Bible or Torah before? Okay, come on. What do you got? The flood. 40 days of rain. 40 nights of rain. 40 days after Noah opened the window of the ark. Everyone remember there was a window on the ark? There's a window, so it's settled. It was 40 days for that. 40 days for embalming. Embalming is mentioned in the Torah. Joseph wanted his father embalmed while they were in Egypt. It was a 40-day period. 40 days of wandering in the desert, which we get to later. 40 lashes, that's the maximum number of lashes and a punishment they could give. 40 days that Goliath marched before the Israelites before David, eventually King David, killed him. 40 days, days that warning that Jonah gave the people. 40. What a coincidence. Ain't it amazing? Everything just seemed to happen in 40. Well, what does it tell us? What we know is it becomes a literary device. This is literature. And just like we, modern writers, use literary devices to foreshadow or to use devices to help us understand the text, they used one as well. And 40 becomes a common notion to reflect a period of time. It wasn't 40 days. It's just, this is time. So the question becomes, how did they come up with 40? Why 40? What was back there in their minds that did that? And the answer is, I don't know. I really wanted to figure that one out. And I read a bunch of articles, and I found one that I liked about, it has to do with the way the calendar is created. And this person gives us and they found amulets and certain materials that would sort of support the evidence that they use this very unusual counting using 40 less 139 about the phases of the moon and creating calendarization. I don't know if that's correct, but it was the only one that seemed to have much weight for me, that seemed to carry it. So all we need to know is certainly 40 is reflective of the fact that this was simply a literary device and the people who were writing were using literature. And they go, the spies are running back, they come right back into the land, and they go to Moses and to Aaron and to the people, the Israelite people at the wilderness of Paran and Kadesh, and they tell them everything that they saw, and they showed them the fruit again. And they showed him the fruit again. Great line. Want the English now? Okay. I didn't want to insult you. I knew you all knew that. Okay. And they came back and they told everything they said, and they said, indeed, this is a land filled with milk and honey. See, you all knew that. Maybe you saw the show, Jerry Herman, 1961 Broadway show. It was not as good as his other shows. I never made it. Dolly made it much further. A land of milk and honey. It's very interesting, that phrase. We tend to associate it with something great and good. Wonderful, rich, an abundant land, a land that is exceedingly fertile. Now, it's interesting. There are scholars who say that's not what it means at all. That in fact it means exactly the opposite. That it was a difficult land. That it was a difficult land. The milk flowing was wild goats. That there were lots of wild animals there and lots of thickets with wild flowers. And the wild flowers meant there were lots of bees. Which is interesting. So here's a phrase that might be understood exactly the opposite today than it was intended. Which also goes back to all this biblical literalism and people quoting the Bible saying this is what it means. Even when you think you know what the words are, you may not know what it means because oftentimes we don't understand the context of the people who wrote it, how they use their language. So what the rabbis have thought this was, oh, this was a great land, this was a wonderful land, this was the perfect land. That was with lots of abundance. But they continued their story. Efeki az ha'am hayoshev ba'aretz v'arim b'turot gedulot ma'od v'gam yalidei ha'anak ra'inu sham. And they continued by saying, however, the people who inhabit the land are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the Anakites there. The Anakites were a people, now it's very unclear, this goes back to this, we don't know exactly what they were referring to. It may have been long-necked, is one way people look at it, meaning that they wore necklaces that made the men look like they had exceedingly long necks, not like they kept their heads up with those necklaces we sometimes see in some tribes. Or it could have meant powerful, or it could have referred back to some Egyptian text that referred to something similar that were referred to as rebels. Or it may have meant some version of this idea of giants because the cities were big. Remember what it said, and the cities were exceedingly large? In Greek literature, we find that sometimes people make assumptions about the people who live in the city based upon the size of the walls that are built. If the walls are big and strong and tall, the assumption is the people who live there must be big and strong and tall. What it probably is, and this is my assessment, is that it's a literary device. What they wanted the people to know is there are dangerous people in the land. There are big people in the land, powerful people in the land. That's where we're going to end right now. So this is the scene. The children of Israel had escaped slavery. They're standing at the edge. 12 scouts come back and start telling them what they saw. Some of it sounds good, and some of it sounds frightening. Big, enormous people, tall, powerful, big walls, big cities. And the Israelites are standing there. And just like every great Jewish meeting, there's an argument. Right? Do we go or do we stay? And then, of course, what do? They turn on Moses. Why did you bring us here? It was bad in Egypt, but it wasn't that bad. So they're standing there in a moment of crisis, deciding what to do. We're going to continue reading this story, talking about it next week. You get to tell the end of the story next week. And our midrashim, our Jewish legends, will be built upon it. So that's where we end. Jews arguing. Go figure.